By 2 a.m., the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade, who had committed 2 of its subordinate armored battalions to capture the Kirtland Air Force Base, had by now succeeded in so doing, as their armored battalions had essentially, with heavy artillery support from their own artillery as well as loitering munitions support from their Shahed 238s, had raced into the installation and hurriedly smashed their way in order to pincer off a large grouping of Air Force personnel before the others had hurriedly retreated into the neighboring international sunport or airport. As the Iranian troops attacking the installation not only had very capable modern main battle tanks in the form of the Karar main battle tank, an indigenously designed Iranian main battle tank, blending concepts of both Western and Eastern tank designs, and their BMP-2 IFVs with their Barak APCs, which were essentially a reverse-engineered version of the Chinese Type 89 APC, as well as also their Sayed fast attack vehicles and Lynx armored recon vehicles, which made up their armored reconnaissance companies in each of the 2 battalions, as they each had one, with their Shahed 238s and their allies providing air support in the form of a pair of Mirage 5s from the Mirage 5 squadron of the Pakistani Air Force committed to just this specific battle space, as well as even heavier support coming from the entire Chinese JH-7 squadron, with each aircraft capable of carrying nearly 20,000 pounds of munitions, over twice what the Mirage 5s could carry, and also providing the electronic warfare jamming assets for jamming the redundant radio communications, and also portable radar sets where they were found that were not necessarily dependent on satellite or upon the internet for functioning, such as air defense radars. These aircraft were a very potent asset of the coalition deployed in this area and would sustain their activities for some time with mid-air refueling, as would the J-10 squadron, which would be flying air superiority operations with their air-to-air munitions, as they were mostly armed with such for their first few sorties, before later becoming completely, nearly fully armed with air-to-ground munitions to add to the already capable and potent forces of the strike aircraft, such as the JH-7s and Mirage 5s committed to this area of the PLAAF and Pakistani Air Force, respectively. These J-10s of the J-10 squadron of the PLAAF were joined by the JF-17B squadron of the Pakistani Air Force, with these 4.5 generation aircraft also flying air superiority operations for the coalition in this particular battle. As they too were armed with a limited number of air-to-ground munitions, they were primarily, just like the J-10s, armed with predominantly air-to-air munitions for their first few sorties, before they would be rearmed with air-to-ground munitions to add again to the already highly potent JH-7s and Mirage 5s that were conducting the strike missions and close air support predominantly of this operation. As the coalition also had very powerful artillery forces in the form of the Pakistani M198 howitzers, which were durable pieces of equipment and could sustain a relatively high rate of fire for some time before maintenance, they were joined effectively by the Iranian self-propelled 155 howitzers, consisting of the M109A1s that equipped the artillery battalion of the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade, as these were set up on a CCP regime property that had a berm constructed upon it for this entire battalion to pull into and utilize as a firing position against the American positions located upon the Kirtland Air Force Base, as the artillery battalion was stationed near the I-25 invasion corridor that would be utilized by the external invasion forces to race hurriedly deep into the United States, traveling all the way up I-25 to join the Trojans as heavy-handed reinforcements who were already deep inland conducting most of the operations. As the 18th PAP Brigade would be shed in this area to assist the local Trojans in the form of the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division and Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade, the 14th PLA Group Army would continue further up before it would join Trojans that were within Colorado and assist them. As now, the Trojan shock forces of the invasion had already since moved into the city as it pertained to the Armored Infantry Battalion and Armored Battalion that originated to the west on CCP regime properties of the Rio Grande, who had already moved up into the city and crossed the last remaining bridges into the downtown area, as the other bridges had already been hit by the Babur Alpha 1 cruise missiles fired by the Pakistani 176 Missile Artillery Regiment, which were terrain-hugging, subsonic, but very accurate and destructive cruise missiles that hit all the bridges, which essentially meant that if the coalition forces wanted another crossing point somewhere in the battle space, they would have to establish it themselves, which was conducted by the Combat Engineer Battalion of one of two brigades comprising the 18th Pakistani Infantry Division, as the headquarters company within the battalion possessed the Chinese-made PB-79A pontoon bridges, which could be launched from a truck by a ferry to cross the river and pull the bridge sections behind it and be established, as the combat engineers would fight for control over both crossings, the last intact crossings that were off limits as per CCP regime edicts, as the I-40 bridge, as well as the adjacent street bridges, were firmly off limits, as these would be required for future logistical and economic usage by the colonization forces for the occupation of the land, as the combat engineers would conduct blocking operations to prevent anybody from fleeing across these bridges, including armed resistance elements, whether reactionary armed civilians or military forces of the Americans, even refugees. These bridges would be highly controlled, as would the areas where they would be essentially conducting their crossing operations in the north with their PB-79A pontoon bridges, which would be laid by the headquarters company elements who carried these PB-79 vehicles and their associated equipment before the strike of 1 a.m. And now that it was 2 a.m., a battle was already erupting in this area, as the American forces, consisting of the 1st of the 200ths comprising companies and one of the support platoons from the support company that were attached to these forces, as this battalion was effectively split in two, with some companies in Santa Fe guarding the state regime quarters areas, as well as also companies that were within the Albuquerque area who originated on bivouac sites in downtown that were promptly shelled heavily by Pakistani artillery forces as their M198 howitzers opened fire repetitively on these sites, as well as being struck by Babur Alpha 1 cruise missiles, again fired by the Pakistani 176 Missile Artillery Regiment, as well as also Chinese-launched cruise and tactical ballistic missiles from the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades, also in Mexico, that were reinforced brigades from called-up reserve units to add extra firepower to these brigades, to their active units. As the active forces fired the latest and greatest of China's missiles, the reserve forces fired missiles that were either widely produced, such as the DH-10A, or missiles that had been put in storage, such as some of the tactical ballistic missiles, the DF-2s and the DF-3s and 4s, that would be fired by these battalions as they were earmarked specifically for their usage as it pertained to the reserves that were called up from the strategic missile forces. As these missiles and artillery struck the downtown area, much of it was left in total ruins, and the American forces conducted the arduous process of trying to scout the area, as at midnight, random anti-satellite and cyber strikes had completely removed all their ISR capabilities, so they were unable to see anything effectively, and as a result, they would make poor plans because all they had to rely on were literally transiting refugees and people fleeing the area, moving to and fro, or their own scouting abilities, as they would have to send out elements to scout the area, which again was an arduous and time-consuming process, by which point the Pakistani armored forces of one of two armored battalions within their infantry division of the 18th Infantry Division will have moved into the area, and also the Combat Engineer Battalion that originated on CCP properties to the west of the river, who will have surrounded and destroyed a grouping of American militia-type forces and rural armed civilians in this area that simply rose up with weapons in hand and were seen by ISR assets, and it was decided that they needed to be removed as a threat to the flanks, and the Combat Engineer Battalion had moved in and surrounded them, and they didn't even know they were being surrounded because they had no ISR capabilities whatsoever at all, and air power was called in to heavily hit their positions and eliminate them with the combo of the ground-based firepower before the combat engineers had raced into the city and were now beginning to arrive into the area by 2 a.m., at which point another large battle was occurring as, again, the American military forces of the 1st of the 200th in the area, as well as Alpha Company from the 2nd of the 198th, which itself was part of the 155th Armored Brigade combat team, which itself was part of the larger Texas 36th ID, which was part of the Texas National Guard. And they had been sent into the area prior to the invasion to train with and conduct interoperability training with the remaining companies of the 1st of the 200th that were not deployed to Santa Fe to the north, as well as the support platoon deployed in the area with them to support the operations of the two companies. As now these two mechanized infantry companies effectively split up looking for ways out of the city, it was determined by the ad hoc commander, as the battalion commander was in Santa Fe, of the operations of the battalion in the area, that they needed to get the hell out of the city as quickly as possible because the city was rapidly becoming a death trap, and they decided to try to break out of the city, ultimately in two directions, after they had scouted the area and gotten news from transiting civilians of rough estimates of Pakistani positions, although they were not known what nationality they were by most of the civilian population. It was at least understood that they were invasion forces, although the American forces quickly came to realize who they were fighting as soon as they clashed with them on the battlefield. As one company would move towards the I-40 bridges, they would ultimately engage the armored battalion of the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division of one of its two brigades that were moving into the area, as well as also the combat engineers moving into the area from one of the two combat engineer battalions, with the other battalion of the other brigade operating in the north and having had laid the PB-79A bridge, as their headquarters company of their battalion had done. They were now guarding the crossing jealously, and the Americans attempting a breakout would end up clashing with them, as well as with mechanized infantry elements, as these mechanized infantry forces, such as these Al-Fad-based mechanized infantry elements, an Al-Fad IFV firing its 40mm autocannon, which was highly destructive, as well as the turret machine gunner firing his Chinese license-made W-85 heavy machine gun, 12.7mm, being followed by an Al-Fad APC version with troops dismounting from their IFV here, and others, including this soldier here, and more off the illustration, which included these soldiers here, dismounting from this APC. This soldier just finished firing a Type 69 Chinese RPG. He's sliding the tube off his shoulder, removing his hand from bracing the RPG, as a smoke trail here indicates the rocket had been fired and now ignited and was flying at a target down the street, as these Pakistani troops, including this squad machine gunner with his Chinese RPD version, the Type 56-1, firing it at enemy forces, firing back from the rubble off in the distance across the street. You can see the muzzle flash from the rubble and the protruding head from the rubble pile here, with artillery slamming in the background, as well as also areas that were completely ablaze on fire. This twisted piece of metal was once a vehicle sitting in the street burning, and the IFVs firing at enemy forces in the distance, as are these troops that had dismounted. This soldier's about to fire another Type 69. They also had the Spanish-made Alcatons, of course, and the Chinese HJ-08s, or their license-built copies. And they're firing the riflemen are firing their Type 56 standard issue rifles, and at these forces off in the rubble, returning fire at them. As they had their company-level quadcopter ISR assets, they're scouting the area around the operations of this particular company, of this battalion, leading them in their missions to essentially engage and destroy their enemies on the battlefield, as these mechanized infantry forces are doing here, firing an Alcaton, and a half squad moving in essentially a wedge formation, a miniature wedge, at these American forces by this gutted building whose facade had collapsed into the street, and this burning M113 full of holes from being shot up and on fire as a result, as these are prone to catching fire due to the aluminum alloy metal that comprised the armor. And these forces that had been unfortunately cut down in the fighting here, and they, in this animation again, are conducting two half-squad maneuvers, as one half-squad with the light machine gunner firing over here and the Alcaton-wielding soldier firing his Alcaton, while the other riflemen, wearing their night vision equipment, are charging across the street. And the Americans, with their M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley IFVs, would be clashing with the Pakistani forces, as again, the American Alpha Company of the 2nd of the 198th, a tank battalion, essentially, an armored battalion, rather. The Alpha Company, being a tank company, would essentially be paired with the American Mechanized Infantry forces with their M113s and Bradleys, and would be clashing with the local Pakistani elements in this particular part of the city as they were trying to attempt a breakout. Yes, a breakout from the city. They were attempting to break out with their vehicles, and when they ran out of fuel, they would plan to abandon their vehicles and continue north into the plateaus of the high desert and also mountainous terrain if they could escape to the mountains. That was their ultimate plan of their ad hoc commander left in charge of the 2 battalions and 1 platoon, as well as also the commander of Alpha Company, a company captain who was effectively trying to coordinate actions with the ad hoc commander of the forces of the 1st of the 200th that were within Albuquerque, as the battalion commander, again, was in the north in Santa Fe, as that was the state capital, and they were trying to protect that area with the other half of the battalion, while the nuclear installation that was beneath Kirtland Air Force Base, that was highly vital to America's nuclear weapons program, and the Sunport were to be protected by these forces that were to bolster them ostensibly. And now they were trying to break out of the city in 2 different directions, as they had previously spent the last 2 hours scouting the area for ways out. And now a battle would occur within a 2-mile by 4-mile area, which would include reactionary armed civilians, a grouping of rural civilians from outside of the city's outer suburbs who decided to try to help people in the city, and en route they would end up seeing the Pakistani pontoon bridge and the forces guarding it, and would end up clashing with them in brutal clashes, attacking the area where the pontoon bridge was. And also, American forces moving into the area would clash with Pakistani mechanized infantry of this battalion right here, crossing in to the city from across the pontoon bridge to reinforce the forces across the bridge, as well as combat engineers that were guarding the area, the bridge and the surrounding area, as that was their operational mission. That was their directive. As the headquarters battalion of one of the 2 comprising brigades of the 18th Infantry Division would also be moving into the area to provide logistical support and backing to the forces in the area. They would not arrive during this particular battle, although this battle would actually last for a longer amount of time than the battles occurring in this area in the northwest of the city. The battle that occurred on I-40, this battle would end up lasting approximately an hour and a half, as there would be a lot of maneuvers occurring as the Russian four-post high-altitude recon drone would be providing the ISR capabilities in this particular battle in terms of the high-altitude capabilities to overlay with the Pakistani company-level quadcopter recon assets that were provided by China and integrated at the company level, as well as also the Russians providing medevac services with their Mi-17 VVS detachment that was operating with the 8th Combined Arms Army to the north. They had combat medics and flight surgeons on these Mi-17s and would be conducting emergency medevacs for some of the most critically wounded of the Pakistani troops, as the Pakistanis would have air superiority and support from their JF-17B squadron, as well as also even their Mirage 5s, which would be contributing rather heavily to this battle, as these Mirage 5s would both drop airdrop munitions and fire rod cruise missiles at enemy targets. They would also have, of course, heavy artillery support from their own M198 artillery forces that were firing both to the east and, of course, to the west, as they would conduct some fire missions to ward off American armed reactionary civilians. As we go to the map here, this is a 2-mile by 4-mile area which encompasses the outer edges of this area right here and this is the area where this battle's occurring. This would be a battle immediately following this battle that's occurring in this 2 by 4 mile area, as this battle over here would be effectively a battle for control over the Reeves power plant, the only power plant in Albuquerque in the city, as well as also control over this segment of I-25, as again, this was a vital invasion route and very important to the coalition to control, as this mechanized infantry battalion moved into the city limits to control any entry and exit from the city from the north, which would block a fairly large portion of I-25, as this armored battalion raced deep into the city, into the downtown area, to surround and destroy reactionary elements and cut off any movement from the downtown area to the east. As now, this area was highly embattled as American forces were attempting to escape. 2 companies were effectively trying to escape the area, and they would end up leaving behind at least 1 mechanized infantry company that was escaping with Alpha Company, of the 2nd of the 198th that was attached to them. They would leave behind their headquarters platoon, who would end up being embattled in this battle that would occur immediately after the battle occurring in this area, as more of this battalion of mechanized infantry would end up crossing and begin to seek control over the highway segment, as well as also for the power plant itself. Embattled would be the armed reactionary civilians in this particular area, combined with the headquarters platoon of the mechanized infantry battalion that was now in this battle here, occurring here, with the elements of the Alpha Company, which was its entire company effectively, and they were attached to the mechanized infantry battalion, but now the battalion had effectively broken up to where 1 company went to try to escape to the west, another company with Alpha Company are trying to escape to the north, and the support platoon that was with them, that was left with them, as it was 2 companies in a platoon plus Alpha Company, they would end up wandering into downtown because there was no communications and no ISR. These forces were now effectively on their own and had broken up, and now confusion reigned as they all tried to escape the city. Going to the map, at the opening of the map, there is enormous activity going on in this large area, as again, this entire area was a 4-mile by 2-mile area in terms of scale. And in this area, there is enormous use of Pakistani air power in the form of Mirage 5s, this one flying in and immediately dropping 4,000 pounds of munitions on the headquarters platoon of the Alpha Company, the tank company that was moving north with one of two mechanized infantry companies of the 1st of the 200th, the battalion that had been left in the city, along with the one support platoon, which was now effectively cut off and on its own and trying to flee through the downtown area and find its own way out. There were also paramilitary forces in this part of the city, local SWAT elements, and some alphabet forces that were posted in the city in the downtown area had moved into this area and were now cut off due to the bridges all being taken out by Babur Alpha 1 cruise missiles all the way up and down the line as it pertained to the city. This Mirage 5 would fly in and give powerful air support with Ra'ad cruise missiles. Although they had a 340-mile range, they wouldn't be fired anywhere nearly as far, as these were fired off-map as they were fired from further away, this indicated by the smoke trail here. They would slam into a Abrams main battle tank and also 3 of these M113s and a Bradley of this platoon here, while this one would be strafed as the nose cannon fire from the very powerful 30mm nose cannon was being fired at this M113, simply tearing it up, which also hit the same Abrams that was hit by this cruise missile flying into it. As now, there were also the other Mirage firing Ra'ad cruise missiles and dropping 2 1,000-pounders and also strafing this area up here. This is Rio Rancho. This is more of an outer suburb and upper class and middle class area here. And the city limits, effectively, were right here, where the city proper is below this line. So all of this is the city proper down here of the city of Albuquerque, and to the north is its outer suburbs of this line that's right here. And everything to the north of it is outer suburbs. This is Rio Rancho, and this is where it starts to fade more into suburban housing neighborhoods before reaching the outer desert and the upper high desert plateaus north of the city. As here, this color-coded rail in mauve color is essentially the Amtrak line, the rail runner line, which effectively crosses New Mexico from north to south, which runs into downtown and leaves the city in this area, running somewhat parallel to the river. As in this area, to the immediate southeast of this area is this area, where another battle would erupt immediately following this battle, wherein the headquarters platoon of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion would be outside of the Reeves power plant, now effectively cut off. As this battle would end, the entire Mechanized Infantry Battalion that would cross the PB-79 pontoon bridge that had earlier been laid by the headquarters company of the Combat Engineer Forces, which were guarding the area jealously, as they would let no enemy forces near the pontoon bridge, as they would be controlling both banks of the river by this point. They would guard the area feverishly, while the Mechanized Infantry Battalion moving in would send its first company across the pontoon bridge. One company of Mechanized Infantry forces would cross the pontoon bridge and end up engaging these Mechanized Infantry troops moving in from the outer suburbs, would end up engaging American forces as they cross, both Mechanized Infantry American forces as well as also the Alpha Company of the 2nd of the 198th in their M1 Abrams tanks, which were a very powerful main battle tank still. Although they were an older design, they were still a very highly capable tank and still one of the best in the world. As Their contemporaries, however, were fully capable of destroying them, as has been seen in many recent conflicts. They were still capable with their 120mm main gun, and their fire control system and ballistic computer were still very adept. And these tanks would cause some casualties among the Pakistani forces, even though the Pakistani forces had total ISR dominance within the coalition, as they would receive high-altitude ISR capabilities from the Russian four-post drone operating over this area, as the four-post was orbiting this area to assist in the battle occurring here. The Pakistani forces, with their full mortar support from the mortar company within the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, would be firing in support of their troops crossing the PB-79A pontoon bridge as laid by the combat engineers, as they would fire these 81mm mortars from their M106 mortar tracks, the version of the M113 that was a mortar track effectively. It was just an M113 that was converted into a mortar track for all intents and purposes. As the mechanized infantry troops would move in and cross the river to engage American forces in the city, they would have powerful support from not just their mortars, but also their artillery forces from their M198 howitzers firing the very potent 155mm shells, as well as also their air power in the form of their Mirage 5s that would basically be dropping munitions on enemy targets, as seen here, as well as also even Shahed 238s that were launched by the Iranian headquarters battalion of the 3rd Armored Brigade of their combat drone company in support of their allies operating in this area. As again, at the very opening, there's a lot of activity going on, as the forces that were basically, besides the American Alpha Company of the 2nd of the 198th and one of the 2 mechanized infantry battalions of the 1st of the 200th, the paramilitary forces consisted of Max Pro MRAPs with light machine guns mounted atop of them, as these were the SWAT/paramilitary elements. They had 4 of these vehicles committed to this area here. And these are armed reactionary civilians in their technicals, i.e., pickup trucks and SUVs with armed men inside of them. And the mortar strikes would come in and cut off their retreat, all ISR directed, as everything in this campaign and the wider invasion is all ISR directed by coalition ISR assets, including the airstrikes, which would pummel and annihilate in this apartment complex within city limits here in northernmost Albuquerque. They would pummel and annihilate the headquarters platoon of the company, of Alpha Company, that was taking position inside of this apartment complex. And these very powerful 4,000-pound munitions that were dropped on them, laser-guided by the passing Mirage 5, that would fire Rod cruise missiles at enemy targets to the north from a fairly short distance, as these had a 340-mile range, firing them actually off-map. The tanks of one platoon of Alpha Company would end up moving in to try to outflank Pakistani forces who were freshly crossing the pontoon bridge, the PB-79A, which was put across the river earlier before 1 a.m., because by 1 a.m., the combat engineers had already crossed and seized full control over the opposite bank, as there were 2 combat engineer companies in just this one area here, as they had their company that was over here on this bank, as they had 3 combat platoons and their support platoon over here, including their truck-based ambulance right here, as the other company here had their headquarters and their armored bridge laying vehicles that were in each of the platoons of the combat engineer forces. This would be a landing zone in the apartment complex here in their parking lot for the Russian aircraft flying in for emergency medivacs to pick up Pakistani critically wounded. As up here a Pakistani air defense battery from the Air Defense Battalion, the Shorad Battalion in the local area that operated both the Chinese HQ-7P for Pakistan, and exported to Pakistan, as well as also Type 59-1 air defense 57mm guns, as well as the radars that went with them to direct them in their firing. They had 4 companies of HQ-7Ps, or batteries of them, and they had 3 batteries of the 57mm air defense guns, which could be utilized also against ground targets, and would be utilized in this battle to hit these American reactionary armed civilians on their flanks, as one battery from this entire battalion firing at American forces across the river, while the combat engineers held their ground and contributed to the battle, as well as also the mechanized infantry battalion, now on the opposite side of the river here by this point, sent their first company across, and more would come across and engage in a battle following this battle. As again, this map of I-25 with 423, a state local highway crossing through this area where the Reeves power plant was immediately to the slight southeast of this battle map, and was a battle that would erupt immediately upon the conclusion of this one. As now, the Shahed 238s, the loitering munitions, as only 5 were able to be committed to this battle because the Iranians needed them in their own battles to the south. They had sent 5, which 2 rammed into this American technical in order to clear the way for the advance of these combat engineers of this single combat engineer company. 1 platoon moving down this way, 2 combat platoons moving this way, and they would split up with 1 going this way and 1 going this way toward the river bank, as they again had 2 other companies here, and they had yet another company from their battalion up here to guard the approaches to their river crossing, as again they guarded this area jealously. This here is a single platoon guarding the northern flanks of the crossing. In this area, again, it's middle class and upscale housing. This is an area of the river and city whereby there's more parklands adjacent to the river crossing. These are like areas with trees and tall grass and like mesquite trees and trees you'd find in the deserty environment in this area, where the bridge had been laid in a parking lot for this park. And there's parklands on the other side where they laid their bridge, and there's some houses on this street right here. This is a street. This is a bridge that had been hit by a Babur Alpha 1 and destroyed. These are neighborhoods up here that lead out into more rural areas on this side of it's mixed rural and housing developments outside of this map. These are technicals that were engaged early on by these air defense forces, who had dismounted troops who simply annihilated them, along with their Tiger MRAPs, Chinese imported MRAPs that had their heavy machine guns, 12.7 millimeters, simply annihilated these vehicles. They got the first one as it's coming up, and then they got the one behind it, and they already destroyed this one on the road as the very first vehicle that they hit. And this farm, or ranch right here, rather, these forces were engaged, and they outflanked them on 2 different sides, vectoring their fire in an L-shape, classic L-shape vectored fire. And they annihilated these personnel, these armed civilians that were at this ranch that was fenced in, had a barn. They simply cut them down before they advanced to this road right here that ran parallel to the rail lines as they curved and moved north, adjacent to the river, as this was the river. As they secured the flanks, the forces would then move 1 squad here and 1 squad here again to guard this area. As these Shahed 238s had hit and destroyed this technical and these personnel right here at the opening of the map, artillery blasts right here at the opening of the map are already wiping out a technical and these personnel running through this area, while these personnel will all end up being cut down by the exchange of fire as this battery of 57mm truck-mounted air defense artillery cannons aim their cannons as they line up and fire across the river and blast these personnel to literal pieces as they try to run into these homes, which are already gutted by artillery strikes from across the road, across the street. These personnel are trying to retreat also from the fire coming from these wedge formations and vehicles of the combat engineers who use the same equipment as the mechanized infantry. As these IFVs, they use the same equipment as the mechanized infantry, with the IFVs firing their heavy 40mm autocannons and 12.7mm turret-based machine guns. As they lack a coax, they simply replace that with just having a turret-based machine gun. And the troops firing their standard small arms, as well as Type 69 RPGs, Al-Qatan one-time use anti-armor weapons, as well as also their HJ08 imported and copied by their indigenously licensed produced versions, such as so here at the American forces to their north, as they basically have them being hit also by the heavy artillery barrage coming into this area, by the artillery forces of both battalions that conduct fire missions against the armed reactionary civilians in this area. As this large grouping, including this technical, are trying to come down this slight ridge right here where they're able to come down with relative ease and being pounded by imminent artillery strikes, as these markers indicate. These personnel were trying to carry out attacks against these combat engineers, as this is a combat engineer company right here. This is one platoon. There are 3 vehicles. There are 3 the Alphads and their M60 AVLB, Armored Vehicle Bridge Layer, behind this grouping, and then there's another platoon with the other vehicles off map, including their AVLB. This platoon's moving in to line up with them by this large house and lay down heavy fire. Although they're being engaged, they're in the prone position with their vehicles behind them, laying down enormous fire, simply annihilating, cutting down these armed reactionary civilians as they emerge into the area, as they're running into the area, just simply getting annihilated. Although they're firing back, it does little to nothing to the vehicles at all. And the turret machine gunners and 40mm autocannons from the IFV and the turret-based machine gunners from the APCs are simply just cutting them down with the small arms fire from their dismounted squads. As these forces are trying to run across the street and from behind this house, they're getting hit by all kinds of heavy fire. These forces are being hit by artillery and being completely annihilated. This grouping right here by this cluster of mesquite trees is being hit by an incoming Shahed 238 loitering munition. These forces end up trying to pull back and escape, but they're hit by artillery. All of its ISR directed everywhere. And these forces are being destroyed quickly. Even as they enter the battlefield, they're being hit by artillery and being wiped completely out. It's complete pandemonium. Some are trying to withdraw and retreat while others are trying to enter like so, and they're all getting cut down. Even as these forces end up retreating from on top of this higher ridge right here, they're getting hit by artillery strikes and destroyed. This grouping tried to stay, which is why they're already surrounded in orange, but this group tried to flee right here, and they got completely destroyed, including the technical. While others try to enter, they're getting hit and destroyed. It's complete pandemonium in the north. As so many things are going on at the same time, it's hard to show in any coherent order, as I always say, but it will be attempted. As all of this fighting is happening and the combat engineers hold the line, including elements from this company guarding this parkland area here to the south of their PB-79A, as they had fought earlier to capture both banks, including sending combat engineers across in rubber rafts to establish a foothold on the other side, who would be supported on the opposite side by combat engineers laying down heavy fire to support them when and where needed. The mechanized infantry came in with their mortar support coming from several miles away, as they had usually a 3-mile range to them, and were basically hitting targets from their positions further afield to the southeast of their mortar positions that were, again, further afield off the map, as they tried to move up and keep pace with the rest of their battalion, their six mechanized infantry companies, with their headquarters and support battalions staying a bit behind with the mortars, who offered support to the advancing mechanized infantry, who were now Moving into the area as they proceeded down this road in this suburban area, as again, the city limits were right here. This is the city limits of Albuquerque, with everything to the south being Albuquerque proper, and all of this to the north being suburbs. This is Rio Rancho, an outer suburb here and beyond here, with the neighborhoods and housing like the suburban housing areas to the north, which led out into the desert, to the open desert plateau north of the city. This aircraft is coming in, firing their Ra'ad cruise missiles, which were each about 1,000 pounds roughly, and of payload, and these 1,000-pound munitions while strafing, because they fired their Ra'ads about here when the jet was here coming through. These jets are moving fast. They're already gone out of the area as soon as you see them here. They're already gone, and they had dropped their payloads and destroyed all of this right here with the incoming artillery. The Ra'ads are flying further afield, hitting anything trying to retreat the area, as there's more off map slightly, and these are going to hit them and destroy them. With the air defense guns setting up here, the 57mm weapons, and aiming them across the river and firing at these homes and these personnel on this high ground, as there's river banks that extend from steep ground up on both sides. They're firing across at these forces and hitting them. As the river couldn't be forded adequately by vehicles, the PB-79A had to be launched as a result, and these forces had to cross. And as they moved in, the Mechanized Infantry Battalion's 1st Advancing Company moving into the area, as this says 1 Battalion Mechanized Infantry. This is from their battalion moving into the area. They're all of their comprising companies. They send 1 company across at first into this area, and they would get a bloody nose as the Americans advanced into the area. And as the battle picks up pace, it will be continued in the next video, as there is so much activity occurring on this battle map on both sides of the river. It will be covered in the next installment of this hypothetical invasion documentary series on 4th generation warfare doctrines as it pertains to the invasion of the United States, primarily by China and also Russia, but also the smaller coalition members such as Pakistan and Iran, who contributed in terms of the 500,000 total other foreign forces and the foreign expeditionary elements. They contributed a fair number of forces. A relatively large number out of that 500,000 were Pakistanis, Iranians, North Koreans, and Belarusians predominantly, but there were also Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and also Serbians and more. There were many smaller coalition member states, but predominantly China provided the lion's share of all the forces involved in the entire nationwide invasion, because they obviously had the most forces under arms between their military and paramilitary. They had the single largest military industrial complex of any nation on earth, completely in the biggest sense of that word, largest. And Russia, the second biggest overall contributor, had the second largest military industrial complex in the entire world, as they had proved during the Great Proxy War in Eastern Europe, as they easily outproduced the entire collective West combined, in not just ammunition, but also in many vehicle types and more. As the Chinese provided 2 squadrons, 1 fighter and 1 ground attack to the coalition. They, by this time of the battle, were heavily supporting the Iranian forces operating in the south, who were already by this time wrapping up their operations and consolidating their positions outside of the International Sunport on both sides of it. The east-facing side of it out in the city, and the west-facing side of it inside of the installation they'd just captured. And were now poised to conduct an operation upon completing the flank clearance to smash the remainder of the Air Force personnel. As between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m., this battle in this area, this 2 by 4 mile area, was occurring, and the Pakistanis had many battalions operating in this area, with some trying to cross, such as this mechanized infantry battalion, while the headquarters of 1 brigade and combat engineers were already here guarding it, and the headquarters moving in to join them. Air Defense Battalion moving up to assist in eliminating the threat to the flanks of the crossing, and the Mechanized Infantry Battalion moving south, not only to capture the power plant, the Reeves Power Station, and also control the I-25 corridor from the north, along with another battalion moving into the north, but to smash the American forces that moved into the area, as shown by this advance marker, as they left behind one of their headquarters platoons of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion that moved up with Alpha Company of the 2nd of the 198th, who was now trying to break out of the city and battle their way out. But they would end up fighting against the Pakistani Mechanized Infantry forces, who, with air power support, would simply smash them, as they also outnumbered them as well. And they had total ISR dominance over them, artillery support, mortar support, and also nearby battalions supporting them, such as the combat engineers, who would jealously control the crossing point they had established on both sides of the river with their PB-79 pontoon bridge they had just laid. More to come in the next installation, as this battle in this 2 by 4 mile scale area will be continued.